Hello, fellow skeptics. It's me, Juliana Byers, and you are listening to this special short episode of The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis, which I'm quite certain is your favourite history podcast out there. Welcome today to the tale of two Johns. These two Johns are so important that I'm not going to start with an immersion. But instead, I'm going to jump right into content and we're going to wind the clock all the way back to 1803, 48 years before the discovery of payable gold in Victoria. And the first person in our story is not John, but William. William Buckley, to be exact, who, it could be argued, was the first white settler in what is now known as Port Phillip Bay. He was a convict who had escaped from a party who were attempting to settle in the area, but the party had returned to Van Diemen's Land, that is modern-day Tasmania, because they couldn't find fresh water. One of the Johns we'll meet later was a child with this party, but I won't get too far ahead of myself. Buckley and two friends also couldn't find fresh water, and they attempted to get back to the settlement, only to find that the ship had left and they were stranded. Buckley elected to stay in the area while his two friends decided to make for Sydney, probably having no idea just how far it was from Port Phillip Bay to Sydney, and unsurprisingly, these two men were never heard from again. Now, Buckley survived. He lived on berries and shellfish for a while before he was eventually taken in by the Wadawurrung people, who believed he was the ghost of a recently deceased tribal leader. He learned the language and became a fully integrated member of the tribe. He married, had two daughters, and Mr. Buckley would not come into contact with another white man until 1835. And according to him, there were white men in Victoria between 1803 and 1835, and it is in 1835 that the tale of two Johns begins. Although I am going to start by acknowledging that I'm podcasting on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation. Now, prior to 1835, there had been at least two attempts to settle in what is now Victoria around the Port Phillip Bay area. But the British administrators, soldiers, convicts, and a few free settlers quickly ran into a very serious problem. As mentioned above, they couldn't find fresh water. There was plenty of it around, as the local Indigenous people knew perfectly well, but the Europeans couldn't find it and they were wary about venturing too far away from the coast and into what was for them effectively uncharted territory. Their notions of racial superiority meant that the idea of asking the Indigenous people for help didn't cross their minds, and getting water transported from Van Diemen's Land was an expensive logistical nightmare. The Indigenous people of this area, primarily the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, were aware of these settlement parties too, but they were not particularly welcoming and had good reason to be suspicious. European settlement in Tasmania and what is now New South Wales had been disastrous. Many Aboriginal tribes in the area that is now Victoria would have had trade and other community connections with those groups and had undoubtedly heard about what happened when these strange white people turned up. If you're interested in learning more, I'd highly recommend the documentary series The Australian Wars, which you can watch for free on SBS On Demand. So the Indigenous people in Victoria would have known what it would have meant for them if a permanent settlement was established on their lands, and despite myths to the contrary, they did not sit quietly and wait to be colonised. However, the early settlement parties who arrived prior to 1835 did not stay long. When they couldn't find water, they went back to Van Diemen's Land. As far as I'm aware, no early settlers came down to Victoria from modern-day New South Wales, although it is possible that some tried and simply vanished into history, with the bush yet to give up their bones. As we heard in the episode on Burke and Wills, the Australian bush was, and let's be honest, still is, a very unforgiving place if you don't know what you're doing or where you're going. In 1835, however, things changed, and it is here that we meet the first of our Johns, John Batman. Rather than landing directly on the coast, Batman chose to sail up what is now the Yarra River in search of fresh water. He reasoned it had to exist in abundance somewhere, because if it didn't, even the Indigenous people would not be able to live in the area. Now, an important note for my local listeners, at this time, the Yarra ran on a very different course than it does today, and ships could sail quite easily up to a point called the Falls. Now, if you are local, the Falls used to be roughly where Queensbridge Street is today, opposite Market Street near Flinders Street Station. The Modern Immigration Museum, which is today well back from the Yarra, originally stood on its bank. So if you're ever in Melbourne, that should give you a sense of just how much we have altered the course of the river since the 1830s. The current Immigration Museum building is not the original building. That building was erected in 1878, but it was built on the same site as the very first Customs House, which the Immigration Museum initially was, and that was a tent, which was erected in 1835. Now, the Falls, as the name implies, was a small waterfall. Ships couldn't continue to sail up the Yarra as the rocks which made up the falls formed a natural barrier, but that section of the river was wide enough at the time to make it a decent port and a turning basin so that ships could either land or head back out to sea. Importantly for the settlers, however, was that the water above the falls was fresh. The rocks not only formed a barrier for ships, but also for salt water. And after making this discovery, Batman began making arrangements to settle permanently. He took his sweet time as he believed that all the land around both Melbourne and Geelong was legally his, and that he was setting up a vast country estate which would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. He was already one of the wealthiest men in Van Diemen's Land when he'd landed in what would become Victoria. He had made a fortune grazing sheep and sold his station there for £10,000, and he then brought that money to the Yarra to use to build the empire he imagined himself to be king of. To put this money in perspective, in 1835, the average free labourer in Van Diemen's Land earned 5 shillings a week, which equated to £13 per year. So the sale of Batman's station in Van Diemen's Land saw him make 769 years' worth of wages for the average labourer in one hit. That's how much money this man had going around. But it wasn't just because of his enormous wealth that Batman felt he could take all the time in the world to bring his vision to life. He had negotiated a treaty with the Wurundjeri people on a previous trip and, in Batman's mind, had legally purchased all the land between what is now Melbourne and Geelong. He called it, and wait for it, I kid you not, Batmania. A few points to note. Batman's treaty was real, although the substance of it has been debated ever since it was signed. Given Indigenous and European concepts of ownership were very different, it's unlikely the Wurundjeri elders who negotiated with Batman interpreted the treaty as he did, or understood that he was requiring them to give up their land to him in perpetuity. Given Batman's record, I doubt he had any intention of following the treaty. He just hoped it would give him a leg to stand on when he tried to evict other settlement parties he knew would follow. Most especially, he wanted to evict the second John of today's story, John Pascoe Fawkner. Fawkner was a fascinating character. Like Batman, he had originally come to Victoria from Van Diemen's Land, but unlike his contemporary, Fawkner had previously lived in the area. He was the child in the early settlement party William Buckley had escaped from. The Fawkner family had accompanied their father and husband, a convict from a white-collar background who had been sentenced to transportation for what today would be called embezzlement, to Van Diemen's Land. Now, this wasn't common, but it was perfectly allowed. If a family had enough money and could pay for their own passage to Australia, they could follow their convict family member if they wanted to. And because the skills of white-collar convicts were in high demand in the colony, as generally free labourers and administrators with those skills didn't want to leave Britain for this strange new land, These men often lived better lives than their petty criminal counterparts. The Fawkner family had been part of a very early party that had tried to establish a settlement around Port Phillip Bay, and of course, as we know, this didn't work. And when they went back to Van Diemen's Land, they went through cycles of plenty and poverty over the years, regular ups and downs. They owned a decent-sized farm, and Fawkner himself worked as a shepherd, a baker, a sly grogger, a firewood carrier, an unlicensed bush lawyer, a clerk, a water carrier, a hotelier, a barman, and a newspaper editor at various points while in Van Diemen's Land. At one stage, he was convicted of helping 7 convicts attempt to escape, and all his life he was a very vocal critic of the transportation system. Now, these convicts he was attempting to assist had to turn back when their boat began to leak, and Fawkner was sentenced to 300 lashes, although whether he was flogged or not is unknown, and 3 years transportation to Norfolk Island. When he was released, he returned to Van Diemen's Land, and once again he rode highs and lows until he made enough money to fund a settlement party to Port Phillip, as Victoria was then called by the Europeans. Now, he had similar ideas to Batman in that he wanted to create a massive empire built on the profits of grazing and agriculture. The main difference was that Fawkner imagined a settlement. Batman felt that Victoria was his country estate. Now, Fawkner's party arrived about 11 weeks after Batman's, and despite coming late, they were better equipped for the area and seized large amounts of land upriver before Batman had even left his camp. Now, the two men had known each other before this and already disliked each other, and I have no doubt Fawkner's actions increased their enmity. In fact, the only reason Fawkner had decided to attempt to settle in Port Phillip Bay was because roughly 15 weeks earlier, Batman had swaggered into the bar Fawkner had been working in at the time, claiming he was now the greatest landowner in all the British Empire, based, of course, on the treaty mentioned above. Fawkner decided Batman needed to be taken down a peg or two and organised his own settlement to what he understood to be unoccupied Crown land. When Batman tried to lean on his treaty to get rid of Fawkner, the British administration in New South Wales laughed him all the way out the door. They agreed with Fawkner and declared the Wurundjeri people's land was Crown land and that Batman's treaty was worthless. I don't want to joke about dispossession and colonialism, but I am so glad that Batmania never caught on as a name. Imagine trying to keep a straight face while trying to tell a curious tourist you were a Batmanian. Batman himself, it is worth pointing out, was not a champion of Indigenous rights and was responsible for some of the most brutal Indigenous massacres in Van Diemen's Land and Victoria, and wrote graphically about it in his journals. I'm not going to quote, but these documents are available through the state libraries of Victoria and Tasmania, although be warned, the depths of creative depravity that this man sank to when murdering Indigenous people are horrific beyond description, and many of them were too much even for his own time. He was fined on several occasions, and really, he should have been hanged for what the magistrates termed excessively brutal treatment of the Indigenous people in Van Diemen's Land. I call it murder. His treatment of Indigenous people in Victoria was no less brutal, and he attempted to use William Buckley, who had been pardoned and reintegrated into colonial society by this point, as an intermediary. Batman wanted the Indigenous people to leave and was annoyed when they refused, and he paid Buckley a substantial annual salary of £50 to work as an interpreter and explain to the people that Batman had bought the land and they needed to clear off indefinitely. When this failed, as it was bound to, Batman resorted to the usual tactics favoured by colonists all over the world: violent dispossession. The Indigenous people were in the way of Batman's ability to make money from his land, so they had to go, and he knew how to make them do just that. They fought back, of course, but Batman brought his experience of successful dispossession with him from Van Diemen's Land and knew how to force these people to go in the most ghastly ways possible. Now, from his perspective, this worked. and he became obscenely rich, rich enough that the £10,000 he'd brought with him from Van Diemen's Land looked like chump change, although he didn't live to enjoy it. Batman became sick shortly after arriving on the Yarra and died in 1839. Before his death, he had managed to set up a station, a general store, and he had an ownership interest in several ships. But he died alone, with only Indigenous attendants who'd been hired to care for him at his side. His wife had already left him, and none of his children had had anything to do with him for years. His wife had been dismissed as flighty, at least according to Batman, and he tried to force her into poverty after his death by only leaving her £5 and barring her from receiving her dowry. Now, she successfully challenged this in the courts in Van Diemen's Land, where she was living at the time. An examination of the court documents suggests that Batman was a violent man, and there is enough evidence to show that he was cruel to his family, which probably explains why he died alone. Now, the Batmans fell out over his money after he died, and by the 1850s, the Batman family had broken up, and they were very much middle-class working Melburnians. They were comfortable, but hardly the kings of the colony that Batman had imagined they should be. So, in this regard, I suppose Fawkner had the last laugh. Not only had Batman failed to evict him, but Fawkner had outlived his hated rival and out-businessed him too. While Batman had been leisurely preparing everything just to his liking, Fawkner's party had simply gone about seizing as much land as they could and planning a settlement. Now, what Fawkner's views on the Indigenous people were are not clear, and he's not known to have taken part in any massacres in either Van Diemen's Land or the Port Phillip district, but Fawkner himself did own a large amount of land, and the only way for European settlers to get land in the 1830s in what became Victoria was to steal it. So even if Fawkner never raised a gun to an Indigenous person, and there's no proof either way, I'd wager it would be impossible for the land he and his party claimed not to have been taken with violence. However, land wasn't the only thing Fawkner was after. No settlement, after all, could run without services, and he'd be damned if Batman got to dictate the terms and sell him necessary goods at massively inflated prices from those ships he owned which crisscrossed back and forward to Van Diemen's Land. As mentioned, this was the really big difference between these two men. Batman wanted Victoria to be his country estate, which would make him and his family rich, where Fawkner wanted to build a settlement and wanted the glory of founding a great colonial city. However, Fawkner also wanted to be the gentleman owner of a country estate, but his designs were rather modest compared to Batman's. He took up a large tract of land just to the north of the Yarra and called it Pascoe Vale. Now, this had been his mother's maiden name, which is why it was also his middle name, and the suburb Pascoe Vale sits roughly on the site of his original country house today. And Fawkner then began building, or more likely employing others, to build what would become his family home and a very profitable farm. Fawkner also had quite savvy business skills, and he quickly set up the colony's first hotel and a newspaper, which went through various iterations of itself between 1838 to 1845. It was the Port Phillip Patriot when, on the 20th of March 1839, Fawkner gleefully reported that Batman had been taken to court by two of his station hands for illegally detaining their tools, and Fawkner went even further and claimed that Batman was of such poor character that he was always in the colony's courts. By this time, the British government had sent administrators and declared the Port Phillip district to be part of New South Wales, much to Batman's fury, who maintained till his dying breath that it was his land, and Melbourne was steadily increasing in size as more and more people arrived to take advantage of what was, to them, free land. The administration did not yet have the ability to regulate land sales, and it would be several more years before there was any form of stable government in the district. Fawkner, however, took it all in his stride and continued opening businesses to serve the needs of the new colonists, and he did it all exceptionally well, although his newspapers never had anything good to say about his great rival. Batman's death notice from the 6th of May 1839 reads in its entirety, "Died this morning, Mr. John Batman. He was one of the first Port Phillip settlers." In contrast, the newspapers in Van Diemen's Land devoted entire pages to Batman's obituary. Fawkner's apathy towards Batman did not end with the man's death, and he published a long article several years later when Batman's oldest son drowned after his horse lost its footing crossing a river. Fawkner cast aspersions on the character of the whole family and suggested that the hand of God had played a part in the younger Batman's death as punishment for the family's greed. As Fawkner wasted no time telling anybody, the remaining Batmans were at the time involved in a series of lengthy court battles over John Batman's money. Fawkner prospered in Victoria, and unlike Batman, he lived to see the fruits of his labour. Much like his life in Van Diemen's Land, he suffered financial highs and lows, and he had to sell a significant amount of land during a major economic depression in the 1840s, but he kept ownership of his estate and made a lot of money from various other business ventures before he eventually went into politics. He began his political career as a market commissioner, and this was an early body of men who monitored the prices for goods as commerce began to pick back up in what had now been officially named the Port Phillip district. Then he was a local councillor before he was appointed to the Legislative Council in 1851, shortly before gold was first found in the colony. When representative government came to Victoria in 1855, he ran for his seat and was elected by a wide majority. And he died in office on the 4th of September 1869 and was the subject of many long and flowery obituaries published in the multiple newspapers which now proliferated the colony. He was often described, particularly in later years, as the grand old man of Melbourne, but he wasn't actually a very nice person. People described him as venomous, and despite being an avowed pacifist, he had a very sharp tongue and hated anyone who disagreed with him, however mildly. He abhorred the death penalty and was a vocal advocate against corporal punishment of any sort, and proudly declared that he would never support the striking of wives, servants, children, or animals. However, he also used his newspapers and, later, his connections at various papers in the colony to viciously defame anyone and ruined people's lives by publishing false rumours about them being, among other things, homosexual, in debt, an atheist, or having Aboriginal blood, which really should give you a sense of just what was seen as important to the early colonists. Fawkner was a deeply religious man with a strong work ethic who felt that sectarian tensions could tear the colony apart and believed passionately in free and secular education, yet he absolutely loathed Catholics and Jews and tried to oppose the building of Catholic churches and synagogues. He was a virulent critic of Victoria's squatter class and the way the land had been locked up, yet most of his money came from sheep farming and leasing land. He fought for the rights of divorced and deserted women, while also fighting against women being able to enter the workforce on the same terms as men or for the same pay. Honestly, I could go on. He was a man of contradictions, and while many of Fawkner's views were surprisingly liberal for his time, and he saw himself as a man of the people, those who knew him actually found him very difficult to like. And there you have it, the tale of two Johns. Now, really, all the people mentioned here could have their own individual episodes, but I hope you've enjoyed this skeptical short, and let me know if you'd like to see more episodes like this. Changes are coming to the podcast, so stay tuned, stay skeptical, and I'll see you next time. This has been The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis, and you can find it wherever you get your favourite shows. The Skeptical Historian is researched, produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode, opening the transcript, and scrolling down to find the sources. That's rss.com/podcasts/the-skeptical-historian. Sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay, and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate license. The music track The Whistle Funk by Telsonic was also used appropriately. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics.